Good afternoon, everybody. Let's begin. Welcome to Eyes in the Sky, Salon number 4. Today we're going to submerge ourselves in the ocean. We're going to fathom its life support system, hear the ocean's polyvocality, reveal rituals, venerations, and relationships. Our conversation will be rooted in oceanic humanities, aesthetics of submergence, and reciprocity in art, science, and indigenous cultures collaborations. I have the immense pleasure to be with Rebeca Méndez and Elizabeth DeLoughrey today. Please join me in welcoming them. Rebeca Méndez is an artist, designer, and educator. She's professor and chair of the UCLA Design Media Arts Department and founder and director of the Counterforce Lab, a research and fieldwork studio dedicated to using art and design to develop creative collaborations, research, and projects around the social and ecological impacts of climate change. Her own research and practice investigates design and media art in public space, critical approaches to public identities and landscape, and artistic projects based on field investigation methods. Méndez's diverse works have been exhibited widely at institutions and biennials worldwide. Her work is represented in numerous public and private collections, including the Los Angeles County Art Museum, LACMA, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, Nevada Art Museum, Museum of Contemporary Art in Oaxaca, El Paso Museum of Art, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Museum. Selected awards include the AIGA Medal in 2017, induction to the One Club Creative Hall of Fame in 2017 as well, the City of Los Angeles Individual Artist Fellowship in 2013, the National Design Award in Communication Design bestowed by the White House and the Smithsonian Institution in 2012, and lastly, the California Community Foundation Mid-Career Fellowship for Visual Artists in 2010. Elizabeth DeLoughrey is a professor in the English department in the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. She teaches post-colonial and indigenous literature courses on the environment, globalization, critical ocean studies, and the anthropocene, with a focus on the Caribbean and Pacific islands, Oceania. She's the author of Routes and Roots, Navigating Caribbean and Pacific Island Literatures in 2007, a study that engages land and sea in literatures of islands and archipelagos, and Allegories of the Anthropocene, which examines climate change and empire in the literary and visual arts. It was published by Duke University in 2019. She's co-editor of the volumes Caribbean Literature and the Environment Between Nature and Culture in 2005, Post-Colonial Ecologies, Literatures of the Environment, 2011, and Global Ecologies and the Environmental Humanities, Post-Colonial Approaches in 2015. She's an advisory member of the Living Archive, Extinction Stories from Oceania Project, and with Thom van Doren, was co-editor of the interdisciplinary open access journal Environmental Humanities. Her scholarship has been supported by institutions such as the American Council of Learned Societies, National Endowment for the Humanities, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, Fulbright New Zealand, and the Rachel Carson Center. And there's a little more, the UC Humanities Research Institute, by the way, and the Cornell Society for the Humanities.
It goes on.
And recently you've been working, and you were awarded a John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship. Well, dear Rebeca and Elizabeth, it's such a pleasure to be in a conversation with you both today. As someone who spent his childhood surfing and growing up in the southwest of France, I have a profound respect for the ocean. I surf a little more rarely these days, but I have a deep appreciation and connection to your work. And I'd like to start by reading a poem, and I will do so in French if I'm allowed to. It's not every day that I'm given the opportunity to speak my own language here. I'll read the English version as well. Dès la plus lointaine enfance, la mer te met en accord cosmique avec les êtres, les lieux les plantes, les animaux, les pierres, les pluies, et les fables enchantées du monde. So from the very beginning, the sea puts you in cosmic harmony with all beings, all places, all plants and animals, rocks and rain, and all of the world's enchanting stories. Another quote here from Rachel Carson: fish, amphibian, and reptile. I'm going to try to get my American accent going again. Fish, amphibian, and reptile, warm-blooded bird, and mammal. Each of us carries in our veins a salty stream in which the elements sodium, potassium, and calcium are combined in almost the same proportions as in seawater. I don't know about you, but I felt this salty stream running through my neck. So, Rebecca, Elizabeth, let's submerge ourselves in the ocean. And I'd like to start with one of the many references that we have in common, that we share, Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway. As we're going to see today, the ocean is a place of interconnectedness, dynamic patterns, and ever-changing fluxes. At the same time, especially for people in the West, the ocean has been a place of colonialism and extractivism. And so in your work, you both grapple with this inheritance. For example, Rebecca, during research for your 6-channel installation, The Sea Around Us, you discovered that DDT barrels were dumped between the 1950s and the 1970s, just off the coast of Palos Verdes. This is really close to us. And Elizabeth, you studied how artists in the Pacific responded to nuclear testings, and so we're going to see a few works by those artists in a moment. But I'm actually tempted to ask, can we stay with the trouble together for a little while and contend with this? And a connected question, after contending with this, how can we engage, reckon with all of this, and re-inhabit the ocean in harmony?
All right, let's take it away.
Let's go.
Thank you, Yogan. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. And also welcome everyone that is on live stream, which we are, of course, with a remote audience as well. I think that, for me, I'd love to just, this idea of staying with the trouble is something that any of us that are dealing with issues of the environment, of the ecological crisis that we are facing, we're constantly having to deal with, and that we teach this. We ask ourselves, how do we engage? Engagement, to me, like really staying with the information, wanting to know more, wanting to learn. The fact that, for example, when I was commissioned by the Laguna Art Museum to create this an artwork for their Art and Nature festival and a special exhibition for 2022. The first question was, or the first thing I wanted to do was to express the multiple voices of the Pacific Ocean right in front of Laguna. So the research led to finding exactly this, right? That between the 40s, like around 47 to 61, the Montrose Chemical Corporation illegally dumped the equivalent of 500,000 barrels of contained and uncontained DDT and DDT sludge that now it's in 14 sites. So that immediately puts us in a place of, how do I then engage with it? How, instead of like, okay, I can't handle that, the way that the Laguna City itself didn't want to handle this. My proposal at the very beginning was to take the 60 barrels that Dr. David Valentine from UC Santa Barbara first went down in 2013 to document, because seeing also those barrels at 3,000 feet in depth make people begin to really take this story seriously. It's not so much, sometimes you hear something and you don't know how to engage, but when, here is our visual culture that is very powerful. And so the idea was to kind of have the ocean vomit those 60 barrels onto their pristine beaches in Laguna Beach. And their arts commission lead, Sean, I forget her last name, but she very much said, no, there's no way this artwork is going to be in Laguna. Our tourism is too important, so we are going to do everything in my power to make sure that your artwork doesn't show in our beaches. So this is interesting, and I just said, so sorry, but you cannot cover the sun with one finger. This story is out, everything is out, and it was so important that even, there was the chemist, Lihini Alihuare, who was doing depositions to Congress about this issue. It just, it's just, again, everywhere. So staying with the trouble to me as an artist, it meant deeply engaging, deeply learning about exactly what are the processes that are happening down there, both chemical and biological, how they are affecting life, and, of course, from the smallest creatures to the top predators of the sea lions, the entire food web, and how does that affect us as humans? So I interpret this staying with the trouble as fully engage, get to know this, really spend, and for me, it's like I'm going to be engaging with the ocean for, I'm committed for the next many, many years. So in the installation that I did for the Laguna Art Museum, which is an immersive installation, 360 degrees, 6 projectors. It's 34 minutes of really everything filmed underwater. It was for us to be able to then engage with all the different aspects that we're talking about. And I know you're going to ask me about the indigenous cultures, because that's an important. But I think that to me, staying with the trouble means dare to face this and feel it, fully feel it, but continue to engage as a group, as a community, as historically how it affects us.
I'll just say, as someone who was lucky enough to go down to see Rebeca's installation a few times, and I think I have a few students here we did a field trip down there. I just want to say how powerful the exhibit is, and the experience of submersion when you get into this room of 6 channels going, and all of this kelp and sea lions and the diver all kind of moving towards you. There's some people who had the experience of feeling seasick, right? And I think this is the kind of experience that I think is one of the critical things that's coming out of oceanic humanities, is to say we need other kinds of sensing in order to understand the oceanic. We need the visual, right? So because David Valentine took these images, we now know about the barrels seeping, right? And so we now actually can visualize the bottom of the sea, a space that we can't actually inhabit as humans, right? So we have to use these technologies in order to then reproduce what's happening out there and engage with it. But what I also love about the exhibit, 2 things. One is that the way that Montrose Chemical could actually just dump all these things at the bottom of the ocean, and what I understand from David Valentine and others, is it wasn't just barrels, it was just pouring DDT off the back of these boats, right? Or putting a spike in a barrel so that it would not float, and then it would actually sink down to the bottom. So when they say barrels, is 500,000 barrels?
500,000 in quantity, right?
Quantity, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean they're in barrels, it means in quantity. And so some of the questions that Rosanna Shia has raised as the environmental reporter for the LA Times, who really broke this story, is that if they thought they could just dump DDT at the bottom of the ocean, what were they afraid of that they put in barrels, right? And that's the other question, right? And so I think this is an ongoing investigation. But what I think is so powerful about the exhibit is that it's the concept of thinking that the bottom of the sea has no relationship to us as humans, and it's not part of a global ecology, is precisely the logic. Would you like me to switch? How's that? Better?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So it's the logic that enables you to think that you can dump all these chemicals at the bottom of the sea and it will not come back to haunt you, or it will not infiltrate the whole ocean ecosystem as well as a global ecosystem, is the logic that creates a binary between the human and nature, right? So this idea that that's nature out there and we're the human, and so you don't actually have to think about the implications of what you're doing because you understand yourself as so separate from that. And this is what I love about the concept of staying with the trouble, which is that you actually can't create that binary. You can't have that binary between the human and the non-human because we're all interconnected. And so that's a really important logic in order to think about environmental stewardship going forward, right? And so that to me is really critical. The other element that I love about this exhibit, and also thank you for bringing in the René Depest quotation. He's a really beautiful Haitian artist and poet, and who actually did a lot of this writing in Paris, which is quite interesting. So in the diaspora. And what Depest and also Rachel Carson are imagining is this idea of the kind of the ocean as mother and the ocean in the blood, right? And I think there are kind of different multiscalar things that happen when you are imagining the ocean. One is that you can imagine the ocean within your blood because of the way that Rachel Carson expanded, the potassium, the salt, right, et cetera. And so you internalize the ocean. But the other side of it is this, the way that the ocean is humanized, right? And this is the way the ocean has become anthropogenic, right, because of our pollution. So to me, that kind of having that dialogue between the two is thinking about the multiscalars, the small ocean in your body, and the embodiment that you may feel in connection to the ocean. That can be through surfing, right, or it can be doing your research work, but also recognizing if we look at plastic waste, Charlie Moore down in Long Beach has been doing some extensive work on that, and the way in which the ocean becomes the Anthropocene ocean, right? I think there's a kind of dialogue between those two, or what Kamal Brathwaite would call a tidalectic, right? There's a kind of conversation and a movement and he imagines that in terms of waves moving, and so there's kind of waves of understanding that are in conversation and cross currents of waves.
And it's interesting in relation to just even the way in which we're beginning to think, in the past, I think last century, even science admits that the mindset was the solution to pollution is dilution. It is so clear now that if we dump something in one corner of the world through currents, through air, through every possible ways, just even the viruses, right? We know that we are so interconnected. So one of the main goals of the work that I did in the Sea Around Us was to be able to really speak about this interconnectedness, and that part of staying with the trouble is accepting that, we are this one world. And even, I think that I have Ellie here, and I keep looking at Ellie. She helped me with so much of the research, the science research, but the mentality that we have now, and even in science, in the World Health Organization, is the idea of One Health, or One Health, in which everything that we do will come back to us. And with this interconnectedness is finally, whereas conceptually, and we knew, talking about indigenous cultures of the region and all over the world, we know that we are so connected. But finally, it's been accepted by this Western world of ours that it is, unless we behave in ways that are good for all, we're all gonna be affected by it. So this interconnectedness, finally, it is much more official in this world, yeah.
And one thing that I forgot to mention in this first question is your work, Elizabeth. You've been engaging also with the reality of nuclear testings. So if we can stay with the trouble just a little longer here, I'm just curious to hear how you've been working and engaging with this issue, because this is an issue. Look at the scale. Look at this map. And French Polynesia, I have a few images that I'd like to share with everyone, because these are images that profoundly, that left a profound imprint on me when I was growing up as a teenager. And I'm going to show you a few of those images of Mururoa. And because I was already surfing, and I don't know, I felt every time, it was in the mid-1990s, every time I would see this in the news, on TV, I felt very, very awkward. So, but I'm curious, Elizabeth, how do you engage and stay with the trouble when it comes to this particular issue? This is of massive scale.
Yeah, I know, we don't have enough time to actually get into scratch the surface on this, but thank you for asking this. It actually started with, there's a beautiful novel by James George, who's a Maori writer from Aotearoa, New Zealand, called Ocean Roads, and he kind of maps settler colonialism in the American West, and then shows how it extends out to the Pacific, and that also includes nuclear testing. And I think most Americans don't know that the US detonated 67 weapons in the Marshall Islands, and these were weapons that were hydrogen weapons, so they were 1,000 1,000 to 2,000 times the yield of the weapons that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So you just have this, and I freak out my students by sharing this, but everyone who's born after 1954, it actually carries a bit of the strontium-90 in their bones. And so that's what forensic scientists do if they find a body and they need to date the body. They actually look for these markers, right? These human-made radiation markers, right? So and then also we know our measurements of climate change also come from the way they were measuring radioactive carbon in the atmosphere after especially after the Bravo test in 1954, where it was distributed all around the world, and so you were finding radioactive carbon in Antarctica, you were finding it in aircraft in India, you were finding all of the, because it's a world system. So what they started to do was actually try to measure whether carbon actually was stable in the atmosphere, and that gave us the footprint for understanding our carbon emissions now. So that kind of logic of thinking about nuclear testing and understanding the impacts of the interconnectedness of our global environment is very much tied to how we understand climate change now. So there's a direct correlation. But I'll also mention Hone Tufere, who's a really beautiful poet who has this gorgeous poem called No Ordinary Sun, which was in response to the French nuclear testing. So part of what happened throughout the Pacific was there was such protest against French nuclear testing in particular, and actually the French government. When my students asked me for evidence of eco-terrorism, I mentioned how the French bombed the Rainbow Warrior on the harbor in New Zealand and killed a photographer working for Greenpeace. Because of the interventions that were being made there, right? And so you had all kinds of people from all over the Pacific showing up in waka, in canoes, in catamarans, in all kinds of boats, and they would just stay in the ocean area where these tests were going to be happening, and then they would force them to stop. So part of it also is thinking about the kind of way in which the ocean became a battleground there. But the danger about the French tests is that they actually are in the reef, right? So, and this is also why the Americans stopped some of their testing after Baker, because once they started putting nuclear weapons into the reef, then they saw how it actually spread through the ocean ecosystem. So because these are atolls that are only a foot or 2 feet over, above ground, you're essentially bombing the ocean in this. And I can also recommend there's a film actually that we're looking at in our class this week called Blowing Up Paradise, which is a really great, we still don't know the extent to which the damage happened in French-occupied Polynesia, where the French won't come out with the records, but we know a little bit more about the Americans, and Barbara Rose Johnson and Holly Barker are two really amazing anthropologists who have actually created a nuclear tribunal so that some Marshall Islanders can actually get some reparations. But because the way radiation bioaccumulates in the body, it actually then gets worse through generations, right? And so the kind of question of throwing money at this problem, the same way that we're talking about, that's the solution to climate change, is obviously deeply problematic. So, okay, I'll stop talking. I have a lot more to say about this.
I have images
but
of
there's
exactly
also,
what you described. Yeah.
There's also Chantal Spitz, who's a really amazing Tahitian writer. She has a really beautiful book that's been translated into English, which is Island of something Dreams. I can't remember. But anyway, so if you're interested in reading more about this, there's quite a body of literature coming out.
And so here's the footage I was referring to. This is from 1996. I remember this very, very clearly. Is it playing? No, it was it? Here, excuse me. This, yeah. I remember, this is Mururoa. And I remember, so in 1996, it was, let me look at my notes again. I think it was 50 years. Yeah. No, excuse me, 50 years after the first nuclear testings, French President François Hollande finally recognized all the harm that those tests have engendered. But here, so we're looking at the final, this was the final, as they called it, test in Mururoa. So it's from the French TV, Journal de 20 heures, January 28, 1996. I'll be happy to share the archives I found with you if that can be helpful, by the way. Yeah, I remember watching those images over and over, especially around 1996, because this is when the French government decided to just stop doing this atrocity. And they're now, geologists are now, looking at the damage that was done and just the complete devastation of the ocean ecology there. It's just.
Can I add
awful.
one more point here? Even just in terms of thinking about the concept of ecology and the ecosystem or ecosystem ecology, a lot that terminology came actually from the nuclear tests in the Pacific. So what happened is after Abel and Baker, they sent out a bunch of biologists out to study the reefs to see how radiation works through a reef, and it actually gave them the understanding about how energy moves through a system. And so what happened is Tom and Eugene Odom, who are kind of considered the kind of American fathers of the institution of ecosystem ecology, they were out there studying it. They were commissioned by the AEC. Then they came back to the U.S. Then they figured, well, we want to inject radioactive tracers into an ecosystem, just like we had seen out at Bikini Atoll and Eniwetok. So we're going to go to Puerto Rico and we're going to inject it into the rainforest there. But what they found is that when they tried to study the injectable, the ones that they had added to the ecosystem, they actually found they already had radioactive iodine and cesium and strontium in the rainforest from the Pacific tests. Right, so it just kind of gives you an understanding that even at that time period when they were trying to understand how radiation moved in a system, even the scientists quite hadn't grasped, right, the extent to which all these systems, of course, are interconnected, right?
And even you mentioned bioaccumulation, right? And that is the way in which that's bioaccumulated. DDT has bioaccumulated for generations, and the research of Dr. Elisa Deming of the Pacific Marine Mammal Center was critical, also very for my work to be able to inform the relationship in which the sea lions that are rescued by the Pacific Marine Mammal Center just right in front of our coast, 1 in 4 dies of cancer because of that bioaccumulation, because of that intense, just generations of generations, and then how the fish that we eat that has been exposed to that, it has been, found in our bodies. And all the people that were exposed to DDT in the 60s that, I remember in Mexico City that, we do have our monsoon and we do have our mosquito time. And my mom would come with a pump and literally spray me, so I'm sure that in my bones and every hair I have that, and it is something that takes generations to be able to understand what are we doing. So the hope is that with this understanding of the One Health, that we stop doing this insanity of really kind of not even thinking I think that Ellie, you put a beautiful line when we were writing the script in this. What if we would have had patience to be able to listen how these animals would react, how all the ecology reacted to what the pollutants were putting in the world, and we would care. If we would have acted with patience and care.
And then we have artists responding. So Liz here, this is part of your research and work. So we have here Ralph Otere, I don't know how to pronounce it, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. And so it's a direct reference to the nuclear testings in Mururoa in Tahiti, in this installation here, Black Light, from the year 2000. There's another response to, right, by Dan Tolapapa Macmillan. And so here you have a triptych, and you have a detail. There's a direct reference, if I can have my pointer here, there's a direct reference to atomic, I suppose, and then Mururoa. That's what I read.
And that's the displaced Bikini Islanders on the right. So he's connecting up both series of tests.
Mm-hmm. So we've been staying with the trouble. I wanted to also mention something about deep sea mining, but I think it's probably time to move away from and take more restorative action. So let me just kind of fast forward to maybe just say a few words. Communities are obviously against deep sea mining. If I can go back to my slides here.
I mean, that's the place where the deep sea mining is moving ahead as if nothing will be affected. And this is the part that is like, haven't we learned anything from the bombs, from the DDT? And now we're just going to completely destroy the bottom of the sea. I mean, it's just
Jürgen,
insane.
do you have the one with the Clarion-Clipperton zone?
With
the Clarion-Clipperton zone, the other slide, do you have that one?
This?
No, that's cool though.
No, yeah, I have a few pictures. This is from a NOAA mission in 2021, September 2021. But this is a a scientific mission off the coast of I think it's on the East Coast, the United States. And so here you see, it's not mining per se, but these are samples, and here you have.
Well, it will be. There's different kinds of mining that they're doing. So some of them are thinking about going to the abyssal plains, like there, and just picking up things. But that's not the extent of it, because you're going to be kicking up silt. You're going to be disrupting a habitat, right? And then the other, I've been talking with a few scientists over at Scripps about the kind of scramble that people are trying to find out what is actually down there before the mining starts in July. So what happened is the Republic of Nauru kicked into play a provision that essentially gave permission to what is called the Metals Company, but they used to be called Nautilus. And I think, to me, that's also super interesting too, because the Nautilus actually technically was the first submarine in France, but then Jules Verne, of course, did his whole 10,000 Leagues Under the Sea based on the Nautilus, right? And so this whole thing about using the Nautilus and then the films that were very popular as almost like an adventure narrative rather than an extractive industry, I think is quite important, right? to recognize. So you have that element, and then you had a relationship between the Nautilus Company and Papua New Guinea that was very extractive, and it ended up creating all kinds of both the company and the government lost billions and millions of dollars. And then the Metals Company rebranded themselves as the Metals Company, and so now they're involved with a few other nations, actually, I should mention. And surprisingly enough, Belgium is one of them. But and so there's a map of the Clarion-Clipperton zone, which is where they're going to start mining, which is just south of...
Is it?
Yes, thank you, yep. Oh, good. Okay, so then you have all the different companies that are involved in this, right, and the different, and where they're based. Now, this area, this whole thing about thinking about the spatial immensity of the ocean. We've talked a lot about this in our classes, the way in which we can never get our head around, like, the size of this ocean, and as a kind of oceanic imaginary, as a kind of impossibility. But this map is the same size as the continental U.S., the area that they're planning to mine, right? So when you see this, it looks like a little area in the Pacific, and it looks like, oh, they're just going to be testing in this one area, but they have an enormous area they're planning to start mining in July. And there's a lot of controversy because people may be familiar with the term greenwashing, right? So there's extractive industries that say we're actually really sustainable. And we're doing this in sustainable ways. Well, there's also blue washing, and so part of this is the kind of blue washing of what the implications are going to be. So, there are unknown. The largest biomass movement that we have on the planet is from the bottom of the sea to the top, right, every day. And so what's going to happen in terms of once the silt starts getting kicked up, then you also are still going to have to bring all the mining, the processing of all the minerals and all that to the land. So it's not like it's going to be contained in the ocean at all, and the ocean itself is always moving. So this idea that it could be contained anyway is a myth. So there's a lot of questions and a lot of concerns because not only just the silt that's going to be kicked up, and then they're going to have these plumes, but also it's a terrible term, but we call the ocean our carbon sink, right? And so much of this sequestration of carbon is done by the ocean. So once you start kicking up all this stuff, right, then you're also kicking up all this carbon as well. So you have areas that they're thinking about as an abyssal plains, but that other map that you had, which had the whole Pacific, that to me is also really shocking because so they're starting over here, right out on the right, and then these are all the areas that are cobalt-rich ferromanganese crusts, polymetallic nodules. Nodules are the ones that are usually on the abyssal plains. But then the polymetallic sulfides and the hydrothermal vents, those are the ones that many people are really concerned about, because we're just understanding how those function and are finding anaerobic creatures there. And so now even our understanding of how life started on this planet is very much tied to those vents, right? So to say deep sea mining covers many different modes of extraction. So it's not just hoovering the bottom of the ocean, which is what a lot of the images are suggesting. Yeah. But I also want to bring it back to the 1960s, because you had the UN Convention, the Law of the Sea, which arose because because of nuclear testing in the oceans, but also because there was a scramble for mining. And so you had the convention start in the Truman comes up with the exclusive economic zones, which extends at territorial waters to 200 miles. And then you had all these other nations also saying, okay, we also get 200 miles out to sea. And what that was for was to get access to these minerals, right? And so it was the idea that there was these strategic minerals and also oil, and so therefore we want to be sovereign over this. But so you had a lot of cultural imagination. You had all kinds of shows and movies. There's this really lovely little one with Janet Leigh called Hello Down There, which is a family that goes down under the water because they're going to start mining, right? But it's like the Jetsons undersea, So you actually had a popular imagination of this in the 60s, but they didn't quite have the technology. Now they think they have the technology, so that's why we're coming a full circle to this oceanic imaginary. So I would tie a lot of this scramble for the seas also to the cultural production of now how we're imagining the ocean. So for those of you who've seen the second iteration of Avatar or Wakanda Forever, right? This idea of kind of imagining the oceanic is partially because it's becoming a territory for extraction, right? It's other things, but that's also, I think, one of the reasons why we're having this shift.
And also because we're seeing that the ocean, like the sequestration of carbon that we're working so hard in one end, the research is of having kelp forests and kelp farms to be able to sequester the carbon, that anything that kind of goes up beyond 1,000 feet, it just really is considered sequestered. And so this completely turns this tables upside down. So the research on one side is kind of bringing that idea of, yes, we can do this, we can sequester the carbon. And then we're going to kick it in 1 second, tons and tons much more. So it really is kind of such a danger. I think what we're seeing with this deep sea mining, it's the world that we don't even know about, but we know that we're going to be upsetting the balances of the earth even further.
And so with that, I guess it's time to take restorative action, right? Yeah. And to do this, maybe I can show you this web page here, drawing the Pacific Blue Line, and it's a number of Pacific communities opposing, obviously, to deep sea mining. And you can sign the petition. There's an online petition.
And please do.
Yeah. Okay, so let's celebrate the polyvocality of the ocean to create a sense of awe, which hopefully will directly leads to an adoration and an increased desire to protect it. Rebecca, I'd like to turn to your installation now, the sea around us. And in an introduction you wrote, the sea around us portrays the ocean as a fully animated body, as well as a place of deep interconnectedness, multi-species kinship, and fraternal coalescence, and ultimately aims to overwhelm a fear of impending doom with a sense of awe that will fuel the courage to face mankind's legacy, to take restorative action, and to not repeat its folly, end quote. And I suggest we watch a preview together now.
Do you have sound?
Kiwel ataong star people, Mont ataong ocean people, Patinggal ataong dolphin people, Pahila ataong sea turtle people, Yahweh wish humans.
And it's so hard to kind of like even visualize this, right? Because it was, if you show the next image, because one of the things about it, it's being, trying to make a single channel clip of 5 minutes of basically 3 hours of footage that it is, 360 experience. This is a moment where we are experiencing the um, footage by Dr. David Valentine of the actual barrels at 3,000 feet in depth from 2013. But anyway, I can talk a little bit about what the piece is, or you have specific questions. Okay, so one of the things that, for me, the moment that I learned about the DDT, of course, I remembered Rachel Carson's work of the Silent Spring, which she published in 1962, and it was all about, the effects of DDT in our population and how we needed to stop that. She made the positions to Congress, and thanks to that, the EPA was also born from that, right? And the environmental movement. So knowing that she also, as a marine biologist, as a scientist, she wrote the most incredible books about the life in the sea. So I read The Sea Around Us, published in 1951. And it's such a completely different way of expressing, just her own, even in her own books, one very specific about DDT, the other one celebrating life at sea. By that time, even if we think that right now, the sea is so mysterious to us, we understand much more the surface of Mars or even of the moon than our own ocean. And yet we are so quick to want to extract, goods from it. But anyway, you read the way that she expresses all the life that happens in the ocean. So the piece itself celebrates life, what we are, what we have to protect still, what we can still care for, at the same time that it contends to this environmental injustice that is happening in front of the California Bight. So the arc of the piece, it pretty much takes you, everything is shut underwater. I'm a diver. I've been diving since I was very young, sometimes living 2-3 months in the beach camping with my family, just so the sea became an extension of the way that I existed in the world. And so it brings you into the world, going through the forests, the kelp forests that we have in front of Catalina, shows you the different creatures that are there. You encounter abalone. Abalone is, so the sea is a character, kelp is a character, abalone is another character that traverses all what I wanted to talk about. Geologic time, 70 million years ago, this creature existed. In the indigenous cultures, it was very important for subsistence, for ceremony, for ornamentation, for currency, and it expands in all indigenous cultures all over the world, in the Pacific area and Caribbean area. And we almost brought it to the point of extinction, so the character was important for us to get to know this creature as one of those beautiful creatures to enter into an interspecies friendship with, right? To kind of have empathy for a creature that you only see it as an object. You only know the shell, most of the people do. So we got a special lens to be able to kind of like film its tentacles and enter into another way of sensing. That's when we get into that tentacular sensing, fingery eyes, which is so beautiful. And from there, we encounter, it takes us to the Anthropocene place. We see structures that we have left and abandoned in the ocean. And then from there, the barrels begin to fall. So it's kind of like our point of switch is the Anthropocene to the barrels that we encounter. Then we have this being, once the barrels are at the bottom, we have a sense of knowing beyond our way of understanding the world. The indigenous voices come in, the indigenous song from the Ahashiman. So the Ahashiman are the indigenous peoples of the Laguna Beach area, the Orange County area. So we contacted Adelia Sandoval, who is the spiritual leader, and she was so interested in being able to tell her cosmology, the story of her people. In the poem that you said at the beginning, it's almost exactly the Ahashiman cosmology. Star people, fascinated by the earth from space, right, come in and they enter the world and realize they are formless, so they become ocean. So they're ocean people. Then they become dolphin people. They become pahila ataum, they become turtle people, and then human, and back again to the stars. So their cosmology that they were wanting to share with us is what it is spoken throughout the piece, in song, in poetry. The shell, the transformative object, transitional object that many indigenous peoples would use, I asked her if they had used the abalone shell as mask, and they had not. So it's interesting in this region, and yet the Ohlone people in the north, Ohlone, abalone woman is part of their own cosmology. But this idea of mask, the only story that we were able to find through research was that young women, when they are coming of age, they see the shell to see their own fate. So they would look into the beautiful iridescent side of that shell. So then I created this transitional space of the mask in which that knowledge of the indigenous could perhaps inform another way of relating and being in the world. So you see that in the piece. Then, you know, the free diver enters the space. Like the scientific process for me was of that of observation, curiosity, analysis. So by her kind of just beginning to relate to those barrels, that's what happens there. And then she comes up again and down again and up again, as if wanting to gain more knowledge. And then that's when she comes down and engages with them, kicks them, is what we can feel as rage and anger, you know, around all of what we have done to our environment. And then at the end, they're there. We are here. It affects us. It's staying with the trouble. So she embraces this trouble, not in a complacent way, but more saying, you are part of my life and my future, and I need to contend with you. And therefore, I need to actually know you. So it's as if we need to befriend our trouble to be able to then know how to speak from it, from our hearts. Because if we just really are dispassionate about this, we will not be able to kind of, I think in my view, create enough movement to be able to, you know, keep our species alive. I think that we are really talking about our interest, you know, species, the sixth extinction, and we are part of that if we're not, I mean, if we don't change our ways. And then, you know, at one point, to me, there's a lot to celebrate. So when the indigenous folks start singing, kids, intergenerational, 4-year-old, all the way to Adelia, you know, 70-something-year-old, is because at that moment, we are speaking to each other. For the first time, perhaps in, you know, centuries, because before, I think science and art was much more connected. That dislocation is beginning to be much more integrated. And I feel that that is, to me, what we can celebrate, that we are sharing stories, we are learning about restoration, bringing in the stories of the indigenous folk as important knowledge, an important way of sensing. The knowledge of the sea lion as much as the knowledge of the deep sea giant mucus larvacean, right? All of the deep sea creatures, they have knowledge to share. So for me, that is a point of important interconnectedness and communication. So thus the piece ends in celebration of the communication. But you know, the reality is that it is a cycle. We come down as if we had learned nothing, and we again dump stuff again. So it also does not, it is not, I don't know, delusional that we have stopped doing this, create this ruckus in the world. Anyway, I don't know what else to say at this point. You might have more questions, but it was incredible to direct so many film shoots underwater. I created my own drums. We oxidated here. Some of my students might be here that helped me oxidize them. Immediately to my team, I brought an evolutionary biologist PhD student, and then Lily Flores Aguilar, that also she is a PhD student in engaging with indigenous cultures in a respectful way. So I knew that I needed to be able to bring a team to be able to speak both the language of science, the language of indigenous peoples, as much as the language of art, to be able to bring us all together. Yeah, and of course you were also advisor, so it was really amazing. Yeah.
And Elizabeth, can you comment on this idea of the oceanic space as an embodied place? That was one of the ways in which, it seems to me at least, you engaged with Rebeca's work and have it kind of relate to oceanic humanities, so this idea of oceanic space as embodied place, if you can say a few words about that.
I have a lot of things I could say about that. I mean, one is that the way in which our own embodiment is tied to our weather, right? Whether your hair is getting flat or curly right now, the way in which our skin gets moisturized. I mean, this is part of a larger oceanic system. And so, I like to think about the ways in which our own bodies every day are responding, right, to this kind of fluidity around us, or maybe the lack of it. And I also wanted to add a few comments too about this unbelievable installation. It's just, what I love so much about it is that it turns to bring it back to the Depest, there's almost like a maternal sea here, right? There's a kind of like, there's a genealogy of women, right, particularly Indigenous women. And then and it's a profoundly feminist work in the sense that, we know that environmental racism and all this dumping and all these things generally disproportionately impact women and children, right? And so there are ways in which this is a kind of recuperative tale that brings women's voices and knowledges back into the story, right? And both in an oral sense, right, in terms of the singing, but also in a haptic sense of the touching of the barrel, right, the touching of the face, looking to the non-human to understand what kind of stories it may have to tell, right? I mean, whether it's the abalone shell or the DDT barrel, right? What are those other stories? So I think this is what I really love about this work, and is that sense of also embodiment, that this is, it's a knowledge that has to be, you have to submerge in order to understand it, and then you also have to have an engagement with this object, and also to care, right? And I think this is also something we've been talking a lot about in our class. Tom Van Dorn has a really great entry on care in the Living Lexicon in Environmental Humanities. And he talks about care, that there can be violence in care, right? It's not a kind of utopian model of care, but care can be also an affective labor, right? And this is something we've been talking about in class. And this to me is the affective labor, right? The interdisciplinary affective labor of putting this together, of the communities that are brought together for this, or the roundtable that we did, right? Which was bringing together arts, humanities, sciences, and an audience that was very involved. Some people from the Coastal Commission, some people from NOAA, the people who are artists saying we need to have these conversations. We need to be, staging spaces for that, right? So, so I just wanted to kind of add a few footnotes to that element of this, but also the way in which kinship relations are maintained, right? Not in necessarily a bloodline way, although it can be, but also understanding kinship relations between the human and the more than human, right? And the way in which that is also explored and also mourned, right? I think about the beauty of those shells, but they're also empty, right? And so there's, the kind of history of over-extraction, right, of the abalone, and the way in which those industries almost made it extinct, is also part of this story, right? So I want to add that part. The embodied, so this is something that we're struggling through in these classes that I'm teaching. So part of it is that we have an abstract, multi-scalar understanding of the oceanic as a kind of universal, right? And this is also when we use the terms like environment, we think in this kind of universal way, but there are a lot of languages that don't actually have a term that's so abstract that it means everything. There are ways in which certain, and languages have very specific ideas for this specific, part of the ocean, right? It's not a universal ocean. So part of what I've been grappling with in my work and my teaching is trying to think through, okay, so we have this kind of oceanic imaginary, right, which is to say that it's this kind of universal, it's a global, it's a planetary element, right, or more than element that actually determines everything from our breathing to our weather. So we have it at that level, but that's a kind of disembodied space, right, which is to say it's not territorialized, even though, of course it is through military and other areas, but the concept of that is a kind of a disembodied one. But what we've been looking at in our classes is looking at, for instance, Middle Passage imaginaries, right? So what would it mean for an African woman who, we're reading River Solomon and Company's The Deep, what it would mean for an African woman who jumps off of a slave ship to then what is her experience of the oceanic, right? And what is, so in a lot of Caribbean literature, you have the ocean as a space of trauma and terror, right? And whether you're thinking about African enslavement or Indian indenture, right? right? And some Chinese indenture as well. So you have the ocean as a space of terror, but also in a lot of the literature, you also have it as a space of rebirth, right? So you do have this imagery of the kind of womb, you know, the violence of that rebirth, and that's Glissant writes about that. There's so many writers that use that as an imaginary. So that's a very specific cultural and historical understanding of the ocean as an embodied place. Like it's a place with a history, with a memory, right? And I think that's also challenging because the ocean is always moving, right? So when they went to do some Middle Passage monuments about 10, 15 years ago, there's a lot of debate as to where you would put it, because you could say, okay, you could say, yes, here's where a number of people died, right? They were maybe thrown off of a ship or they leapt off a ship. But the ocean's always moving. So that concept of trying to monumentalize something that's dynamic and always in motion, I think is one of the challenges that the ocean brings to us, and then Derek Walcott has written extensively about that in terms of thinking about the sea as history, right? It's always moving. The waves are always bringing new stories, right? So that's part of it, but then also to think about it as embodied place is also to think, for instance, for Polynesian migration across the Pacific, the waka, the voyaging canoe, is understood as a vessel, as a body, as the people writ large. So then your experience of the oceanic is, in some of these wayfinding traditions, the canoe is steady, and the ocean and the stars move towards you, right? So it's a completely non-Euclidean model of thinking about the way that you're in a dynamic force, right? And it's understanding force, the ocean as force, right? I think that's something that's also very cultural and historical as well, but it's also understood. If you trace your genealogy to a voyaging vessel, right, you have an oceanic origin, right? So I think there are other ways of understanding the oceanic as an embodied place, and that can mean your genealogy, right? Whether we want to think about it in terms of Rachel Carson saying, you know, an evolutionary genealogy, or if you're particularly, you know, your iwi or tribe in New Zealand is tied to a voyaging canoe, then you have your own kind of a way of the ocean as an embodied place, but also as a generative space, right, for your culture.
And it's interesting because as you speak about this, reminds me that one of the things that when I started researching about, I wanted for sure to only incorporate in my work Pacific Islanders, right? That I needed to have that voice of the people that experienced this, especially the Eastern Pacific Ocean. As you know, as they mentioned, it's like for them it was very much a source of life, a source of abundance of, you know, through the abalone. Of course, I chose it as that, as a symbol. But, you know, the difference between us that we extract and use it as resource, for them it was source of story, source of connection to ancestors, source of being able to, you know, just their own food and all. But one of the things about the Pacific, the Catalina Island, all the Channel Islands, Catalina, they were always considered part of Polynesia, right? It was only through colonialism that they were segmented and fragmented. But, you know, for them, it's like they really consider themselves as this entire, you know, continuously moving space that they embody every time that they engage with it. So that was a wonderful thing to kind of, you know, work with.
Well, Rebecca and Elizabeth, I guess this is a good place to open it up to questions, unless you have anything else you want to add. But I mean, I was taking notes. The source, I mean, the ocean is a source of life, source of stories, connections, and this idea that waves are always bringing new stories deeply, deeply resonated with me, and I hope with you as well. Thank you so much. I guess it's a good place to open it up to questions now.
Yeah, no, I love questions. Yeah, thank you.
So if you have a question, just raise your hand. I'm going to find you with the wireless mic, and we're going to do a little bit of a change here. Mm-hmm. You can use this one.
Okay.
And then I'm going to use
Here goes. Okay, wonderful. All right.
So,
Am I on it? Yeah. There you go.
any questions? Ursula.
Thank you. That was awesome. My question is sort of a fairly abstract conceptual one. So I was wondering if both of you could talk a little bit more about the possible tension between what you've been talking about. On one hand, the resistance to imagining the ocean, and I assume by extension also other ecosystems, as universal, that you just articulated, Liz, versus, Rebecca, your emphasis on sort of global interconnectedness. How do we think both of those together? Because I think that is a real tension within environmental thought in general, which is why I'm kind of interested in it, that on one hand, we do want to think interconnection, and on the other hand, at least in the United States, there's an incredible emphasis on culture as difference and culture as sort of defining different identities. I don't think that's necessarily true everywhere. I think identity is looked at and culture is looked at in other ways and in other parts of the globe. But I think that is a real tension, and so I'm trying to think, so how do we think that, especially in the context of the oceans?
Yes, I can, thank you for that great question, because this is something that I've been trying to work through for many years. And I always turn to Edouard Glissant, who's the Martinican theorist, and his work. I mean, in Caribbean Discourse, he actually talks extensively about concepts of sameness and difference and how we need to have them simultaneously. But interestingly enough, he's very influenced by French post-structural theory, right? So he's reading Deleuze and Guattari, he's reading, Foucault, he's reading all these, and then he's actually saying, but in the Caribbean context, here's why we need to have this, right? Because he wants to think about, oral poetics, right? The things that were forced out through the process of racial capitalism, et cetera, and he wants to think about, what are the ways that are what are the things that we can recuperate from that? What are the stories we can recuperate? But also, what are the structures that we can also use, right? That may also come from a history of violence. So I find his the opening to his later book, which is Poetics of Relation, very much engaging with that, and he speaks very much about the kind of that it's a very specific experience from someone who's of African descent in the Caribbean, but at the same time, he imagines it as a vessel that we also sail for others. So you need to have that experience, but you also need to have the boat. He calls it the open boat, right? The boat has to be open. And then, of course, he and Kamal Brathwaite have been super informative to my thought about this. But Brathwaite has a theory of dialectics, right, which I understand as taking a European model of dialectics, which is, thesis, counterthesis, synthesis, right, and refusing the synthesis, right? So we need to have actually both things on the table. The more I think about it, and he uses the wave and the kind of motion of the ocean as a kind of model, and the more I've been thinking about it, the more I'm realizing that the ocean itself is not, we have this idea that the waves come in, right, but they come in sets, right, and then there's rogue waves, then there's all, and I thought, the more I thought of it, and where I thought, actually, that's a really great metaphor, because you have all this kind of difference. You have this influences depending on whether, you have this or that vessel in the ocean, this or that wind, right? You actually can allow for a lot of dynamic movement, which also hopefully leads to more dynamic thought, right? That you can have the both and. So that's how I've worked through it.
Yeah, and I would definitely, I love that question, because abstraction in the way in which we can think of, and especially around Deleuze and Guattari that we were talking about, is like, if we think in terms of intensities, right? The idea of immanence and intensities, then we can hold both at the same time, but when one has a little bit more of the one aspect or another, right? So if it is about the interconnectedness, we can only need to even just look at the currents, our oceanic currents, to know that whatever I drop here immediately just moves around. So there is that interconnectedness in one very visible way, but it's also a metaphoric way, that we can think in terms of interconnectedness to our ancestors and other ways of looking at that. But then also we can really think local, based on the moment that we are speaking about, the usage of something for that specific person. For example, even when I was researching about the abalone, I ended up finding that, of course, I knew that in my Mexican, heritage, the Aztecan, the goddess Chalchiquitl, she's the goddess of the ocean. She has abalone shell eyes. So even in the center of the city, right, that in the Aztec, abalone was very present. So that's very interconnected and yet is very localized. So I do think that to me is a lot about intensities. What are we looking at and when and through what lens that would make us feel a little bit more in the or, but it's always in the and, where I think that we can suspend the opposites and really almost that to me also is part of staying with the trouble. Mm-hmm. I don't know if that answered anything close to it.
Hi, thank you for this. So I come from science, from ecology and evolutionary biology, which both of you know, but one thing I think about a lot based on what y'all were talking about is that there are kind of two sides of science. One is the science or the scientific process that can create something that turns out to be a problem when filtered through society. And then the other side is learning about the effects or learning about these interconnections in a way that can be involved in some sort of response. So I guess I'm curious how I view my science or how to do an ethical science is considering how questions are filtered by society and by funding and what I ask, and then how it might then in the results be filtered back through society and what is applied. So I'm curious what your views are on, I guess, the ethics of science and the scientific process when it's coming to things like creating DDT, or the knowledge that then can be used or bastardized in some way to cause harm environmentally, given the social environment through which that science occurs.
Yes, I can take that on. Mainly because both my parents were chemical engineers, right? So even that era of inventing from plastics to DDT to all kinds of things, that it was a celebration of, chemistry, right? And exploring chemistry. I would say that so much of what it is, the idea of continuously being, testing, what is it, how is it that we can, because DDT was created to be able to deal with malaria, right? And so it had a very good intention, but there never was the time to just take care of how is it reacting and how will affect everything. Immediately enters a corporate greed. So when it leaves the hands of the science and it enters into the corporate greed is when I think, to me, things get out of hand. Even, for example, when we were working with about the Dole chemical that was sprayed in all of the bananas and that ended up causing a lot of Dow chemicals. That was a chemical that was created, again, let's kind of control pesticides and the pests of the bananas, but the main thing was so it actually can make Dole rich. So Dow Chemicals knew that this was causing cancer in women and sterility in men, and they stopped it as soon as they knew, but Dole came and sued Dow and said, you under contract need to sell me to the last drop. And they started then spraying everywhere in Nicaragua, in Africa, and everything, knowing that it was killing people. So I would say that to me it escapes it whenever it goes to the greed of the scale of the corporation. And I do think that DDT ended up there. Of course, extractivism, deep sea mining is right there. It's now the corporations are just, sure, here is the data that we're going to destroy pretty much the entire, the CO2, who cares? Now is what matters. And so these now shareholders, profits, what matters, to me, those two do not communicate. And that's, I see those as the two sides to me. I don't know if that's something that you were maybe referring to, Ellie, or even within the research part, there's the two sides as well.
I can add to that too. I love that question. Thank you. To me, it's very much about temporality, right? We're understanding, and Rob Nixon has a concept that people have been adapting called slow violence, right? And so it's the understanding of what this impact is, decades, centuries, right? And having an understanding about what the long-term implications are is precisely the challenge when you're doing a short-term research grant, right? And we know because we've been working on one together, and it's like, okay, the work has to be done in this way, in this time scale, right? But the kind of raising, for me, it's an epistemological question, is to raise the question about temporality and actually think beyond our election cycles, right? And all the other things that actually make so much of our decision making caught up in the short term, right? Which has to do with profit or has to do with, whoever is actually going to be able to fund your project.
Oh, we have 4 questions. Okay, I'm good. 1, 2, maybe, yeah, Adrian.
You said one more?
However many, yeah, just many.
Hello, thanks for your time. My question is to Rebecca. So this certainly isn't a documentary film, but I say I can see some similarities. And then in documentary, because documentary films tend to have a pretty salient purpose, and it seems to me, I think I could see one here. But certainly documentary films take a lot of liberties with filmic language, right? Whether or not they're going to be overtly beautiful or the editing techniques, but they seem to be subservient to a more specific purpose in documentary. And I would say in a work like this, if you could tell me about your thoughts regarding aesthetics and their role, if a work has a very salient purpose, where in the hierarchy of importance is beauty, and does it have a utilitarian purpose, or how does it being beautiful make the project more meaningful or more potent in its goals? So anything that you'd care to share about that, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, of course. Very good question. I think that one of the things that we're not seeing in this work is the gallery that, the work was in 2 galleries. And in one of the galleries, I had all of the articles from the LA Times, from Rosanna Shia, that informed the work. They were printed there so people could read all about that. I had also a library of the books I consulted. And then, of course, you had your wall text, and then I had a poem that was created on the 7 directions of the Tongva tradition. So inevitably, the work is framed with this research because it's a research-based artwork. So that already is a different kind of artwork. Once you enter the space, I want you to be arrested with your senses. I want you to feel something. I want you to be in such awe about what you are seeing that you really can understand with your body, not just with your reason, that this matters, and that you actually may care about the life of these creatures that I have introduced you to, and that, with your heart, you're able to remain engaged, and then you can perhaps, find more about it, you can vote, you can become an activist, you can do all those things. But if I fail about you feeling something, that's where the artwork fails, right? Sometimes documentaries don't make you feel anything because they are so incredibly well-researched, strong, but also you don't want to know. Your heart is not able to engage yet. So as artists, we cannot change the world, but maybe I can help you feel something and change your mind a little bit, right? Change your heart a little bit. So as I specifically keep it in the art world so that I have that freedom to have you feel with all your body, embodied experience. It's an installation. People would sit there. They lay there. They were leaning. They were staying there 3, 4, 5 times. They would see it. So I'm actually, the experience is different. So I'm hoping that with that, the artwork is able to then move you forward.
Thank you.
Do you have a question? No. Who else? We had 3, 2 here.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this. Just to pick up on the temporality point that you made, Elizabeth, I was really struck watching the film, Rebecca, the speed and the temporality and, for example, the way, the slowness with which the barrel drops is really striking. And I think in some ways you've answered this already, but, Elizabeth was talking about this deadline of July, where I'm starting to get so anxious about, oh my gosh, it's so soon. And so I'm just so curious about the ways in which the different forms of speed and time that happens underwater kind of, I don't know, maybe it's a question for both of you, but it just, in relation to the Nixon and slow violence and activism, it seems like it opens up a lot of possibilities.
I don't know if you want to
Go ahead.
Okay, so one of the things that I know when I am underwater is the same. I wanted to be an astronaut when I was young. And it was because of the fascination of otherness and other space, another sense of, how the universe, just the speed by how it moves is so different. I go and film in the Arctic and Iceland because geology seems to me that moves at a different speed. Well, the ocean is the closest to my imagination of what being in outer space would be. When I first was, getting my advanced diver license, and I went to, 80 feet, but it was 300 fall, and I was just in this nothingness. There was as if I had transformed, and I had become the water. My skin had disappeared. And so it has been the one way in which I really feel that I dissolve into otherness and I dissolve into the world. So as a physical sensation, that is one of the things that I experience. I move much slower in that space. So we shot at 90 frames per second because of that, to be able to kind of also let you see that not only this temporality by which they dumped from, over a decade, these barrels. And if you see it in the installation, one drops here, one drops here, one drops there, one drops there. And then you see this one falling down, and then another one starts dropping. So it's my way of also saying this is endless, not was endless, is endless. It continues to happen. So the way that we continue to pollute the world is endless. Now, as she engages with this material, it also is like she can't even push a barrel with her body because there is a different kind of sense of gravity there. So for me, it's a metaphor of the way in which these problems are really, they're hyper objects. They're enormous. Climate change is a hyper object in which our own physicality has so little sense of potency. Our individuality. So one vote, what is that going to do? Well, it can do a lot, right? One artist, one person. So there is a sense of futility in the way that as she pushes, as she rides down this barrel, as she embraces it, right? That there is a little bit of always, it's not necessarily a viscosity, but there is a slowness because you also need to go deep in your heart to know how you want to respond to this.
Hi, thank you guys so much. That was amazing. You started to touch on the question that I have just in that answer right now, but I was wondering what you think, for both of you, the future of the climate justice movement will look like. Like where should we be turning our energy towards, especially as there is so much greenwashing, so much of a lack of interconnectedness in practice of social justice. And I love the concept of staying with the trouble. And I think that's like super, super radical from like a personal level of like going deep in your heart to like an institutional level of like not just immediately disregarding of that which is uncomfortable or harmful. So like how do we put that into practice? Where should we be turning our energy towards in terms of climate activism?
Thank you, Rachel. This is something we're debating in our class, right? In our class on the Anthropocene and climate change. And one of the things that we've been talking about quite extensively is well, number one is narrative, right? I think this is also what we've been summarizing here, is that how can you tell a story in a way that actually engages with a deeper temporality of the ocean, or that engages with the way in which your own body is merging into another element. And, we are merged into this element here, right? In this really, really cold air that we're sitting in this classroom. we're a part of this, but when you have this oceanic experience, suddenly that becomes so much more present, right? Because you can't breathe in your normative ways, right? You need the technology in order for you to have that submersion and that experience, and then suddenly you kind of become aware of yourself as a body in a particular kind of space. So part of it is thinking about different kinds of knowledges and different kinds of ontologies, like we've been speaking of, but also understanding narrative is super critical for any kind of activism, right? Because then you can say that's greenwashing, that's blue washing. Okay, so you're saying we have to do this mining because we need cobalt. Well, how come we've already already started developing new electric car, resources, right? That we actually, cobalt may not even be the mineral that we're going to be needing. So part of it is also to understand how certain narratives are used, right? Because this is why marketing is so important for especially the extractive industries. But I was also listening to a podcast yesterday about the book that just came out about Palo Alto and its kind of rise of capitalism. And one of the points the author had made was that innovation was absolutely critical in order for understanding kind of the Silicon Valley and kind of creating Stanford and all of its kind of way in which it markets itself as a kind of space for ideas. And this is something we've been discussing in our class, especially in relationship to the X Prize readings, right? And that this idea of the imagination and innovation is absolutely a currency, right? It is a currency. And so if we are sharing this information, then this becomes super important for counter narrative, right? And for counteracting.
And I think that, we need to engage in so many ways, right? One of them is your activist group that you join Extinction Rebellion, and then you go and protest with that. Second one is you make sure you're informed, you vote. Next one is you are engaging in the collaboration with your friends. Next one is you teach. I created the Counterforce Lab because I knew that between teaching and my artwork, that was not enough. That I needed to be able to create a laboratory specifically of artists and scientists and everybody, writers, thinkers, to be able to collectively think, how is it that we engage with this ecological crisis? So for me, it's like there's not one single way, but it's the many ways you can do it. With what you buy, with what we vote with our wallet, what we eat, is just being vegan matters. So I think that there's all these different ways in which we choose to do it. And again, back in intensities, the artwork in so many ways for me is the way to soothe my soul. Because there's times that I just don't have the energy to get up in the morning because it's so painful to deal with our world. But then I go diving and I see this magnificence, and it's just my heart fills with love for this world. And so sometimes it really is how I go into one direction and I feel like I just cannot breathe anymore. And then I go and I, create the artwork that it just brings me life. Rage with love, exactly, right? Rage with love, because it really is very, very difficult. And, Sylvia Earle said it very, very clearly when she, very simply, in almost like a mantra, she said, no blue, no green, no ocean, no life. And I think that is the kind of language that can really, it hits our heart, and also we can kind of, take it further. But yeah. We rage with love, yeah.
Other questions?
Erin, did you have a question?
Oh, Erin.
So like we're running out of time. Wow, there's so much to say, and this is so fabulous and wonderful. One thing I just wanted to say is just being in the installation, Rebeca, and your body being in it, being surrounded, and in this immersive installation is so important, and it's hard to translate that via the images. So for sure that you've given us, both of you, your contributions to this idea of the imaginary, the oceanic imaginary, is so fabulous. And at the very beginning of this discussion, we talked about the barrels being dumped into the ocean, as though the ocean were this void, as though it were this nothingness that you can safely dump this stuff. So I'm interested in this idea of the ocean, the imaginary of the ocean as this subconscious space, of this wastebasket, of the void. If you put it there, it goes away magically, right? Which of course we know it doesn't. But can you talk a bit about that? And Rebeca, what you're doing is literally like a counter narrative to that, right? And it makes me think of Amitav Ghosh's wonderful diction to artists to go out there and reanimate the earth. That's what you are doing. You are reanimating us, our stories, our understanding of it. And I applaud what you've done here. But I'd love to hear what you all think about this idea of the ocean, the imaginary, of a void.
I mean, I think Rebecca's work answers that question so beautifully, right? I mean, I think it's somewhere in my writing about the ocean, I talk about how the Latin term for vastus also means ocean and means waste, right? This idea that it's this, and actually in the old British, I know this from Laura Brown, the term shore also means sewer. So there are all these senses that became a dumping ground, right? And if you've been up to up the coast where they have all the sea glass, or they just dumped trucks, right, of sea glass and ceramics and all that, and that are still there, which is very different than the things that we're dumping now, which are there's no ending to them, right? These are forever chemicals. These are plastics, right? That we don't know if they're ever really going to break down. So I think part of the thinking about the ocean as void is to say, yes, there has been this kind of imaginary. It's a very Western, very European, Anglo-American imaginary. But on the other hand, it also denies the way in which, whether it's fishing communities to migration to even the question about empire. I mean, James Anthony Froude, he's a great apologist for the British Empire, and he used to write in the 19th century that the Norse blood flows in us, and so therefore we're going to go conquer the seas, right? And this idea and also an internalization of the ocean, but it's also understanding that the ocean, and Hegel writes about this. I mean, so many European thinkers write about the ocean as absolutely critical to civilization, right, in quotation marks. So it's to say, yes, there is that narrative, but then there are these other narratives that also can be imperial, right? They're just as sticky and uncomfortable to think with. But what I love about Rebecca's work and some of the authors that we're doing in our class is to kind of rethink the oceanic as an embodied place, right? As a kind of space of kinship, of relation, and a space of care, right? Which I think is absolutely critical.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing in relation to, I think you were going there a little bit, Erin, is that it is almost like, every time that you dream, like in Jungian Carl Jung, and that every time that you have a dream of the water, right, underwater, you're dealing with your subconscious. So it is indeed the shadow, right, the shadow of everything that we have. We don't want to talk about. We just dump it in the ocean, dump it in, and this shadow is vomiting it back, right? Because without shedding light to this, we simply will, the demise of the human species is tied to how we deal with the oceans. It is the next, this next years, couple of decades, will determine whether we survive as a species or not. And big part of it is the ocean. And so it is as if we're now having to shed light into that which we have been keeping in the dark, not wanting to know. And so with the work, just being able to bring to people the idea that this is full of life. And not only full of life, but the life that will actually almost guarantee our own life, right? So it is something that it is finally shedding light to that shadow of centuries that is super Western, of course. Yeah, the Western thought.
One last question. Okay.
No, it's okay. We're here. No, go ahead.
Thank you both for a really wonderful talk. This is sort of like not as deep maybe or interesting, but I am so new to this information about the amount of deep sea mining that they're talking about, and it's so saddening and startling. And I'm just wondering, like the map that you showed of the very large site that's being prospected, what is the legal narrative around that? Like it being a no man's land, it appears, but then maybe equally everyone's interest, and I'm just curious how that's being handled.
Yeah, that's a great question. This is for a legal scholar who, would know a lot more than I would, but those maps actually, I'm glad you asked, they're on the ISA, the International Seabed Authority website, so you can feel free to explore their website and see what they're up to, and that big one was a total shock to me because I had no idea they already were projecting. The way that the ocean is partitioned off is that you have the 200-mile exclusive economic zone. So if you were going to mine, like in Papua New Guinea, they wanted to mine there, and that was within their coastal shoreline, right? But then you get into international seabed, right? And that's a whole other thing. Now, there's a lot of critiques of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea because it was imagining ocean as a resource, not as a protected zone, right? And so I think a lot of this is going to fall into the same kind of debates that have been happening around Antarctica, right, in terms of who has access to it, whether it's shared equally, right, amongst all nations, which it's not, and then who gets the resources, then who actually has the technology to come in with these enormous machines, right? Those Hoovers that they were showing, they're as big as this building, right? They're enormous. So part of it is also, it's the same kind of, global South issue that has been happening with the partitioning of the planet, through colonialism. It's still a colonial regime. It's just that there have been people like Elizabeth Mann Borghese and Arvid Pardo and others who have tried to make it the common heritage of all mankind. But unfortunately, the legal precedent, legal protocols, as far as I'm understanding them, Iris Braverman just came out with a book, and I was involved with that, called, it's something about, something about the laws of the sea, but and we have a whole conversation about that in there, so that would be a good resource to look, to get more specific into the nitty-gritty. But my understanding is that if it's international waters, it's whoever has the most power, right? And so the way, like, the US is sending missiles out to Kwajalein from here and then declaring all these areas 50,000 square miles is off limits because they're doing testing, right? So it's just who has the power to then make those claims. So that is my understanding of it.
And maybe before we close, I just want to do a shout out to all my team, because I have to say that to make this artwork, it took about 50 of us, 50 people that were helping at all moments. And especially, I think I want to shout out to Rahat Mahajan, who was my editor, and then Drew Schnur, who was a composer. What incredible team, and of course my researchers. Elif is here, but it takes a tribe, and I'm so grateful to all. Yeah.
Yes. And thank you to Jochen for being our
Jochen.
beautiful, organized host.
Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and let's rage with love, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
We didn't have to prepare at all. No. We know it. This is our world.